The Parkinson's podcast is brought to you by the Davis-Phinney Foundation and brings you the stories, wisdom, and expertise of people living with Parkinson's, care partners, and Parkinson's professionals. In this episode of the Parkinson's podcast, Chris Krueger talks with a clinical research team from University of Toronto about how the clinical trial process works, how participants can have the best experience in a trial, and why a team approach to trials is necessary and good. In this episode, you'll hear from Dr. Alfonso Fasano, Dr. Arturo Abundes Corona, Sara Naghdlou, a clinical research coordinator with a background in biomedical engineering, and Yu-Yan Poon, a registered nurse who supports trials at the University of Toronto. In keeping with the open and welcoming spirit the team describes, they invited Chris to use their first names. This episode is sponsored by Blue Rock Therapeutics.
Hi, Alfonso. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your background and how you came to be involved in Parkinson's research?
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. And I decided to become a neurologist because I was fascinated when I was a student by deep brain stimulation. Back then, it was early days that DBS was used, and it was mind-blowing when I saw the first patient. I was a medical student. So I knew already that studying neurology, I wanted to do deep brain stimulation. And because deep brain stimulation is largely used in Parkinson's disease, automatically Parkinson's disease became the disease of interest. And now here I am.
Great. And so as I've seen your name in a lot of different trial reports, and you participate in a lot of studies in terms of helping to run the studies and being a PI on a lot of research. Why is that necessary? Why are clinical trials necessary?
Absolutely. This is the real reason we are doing this podcast today, because it's unfortunately not discussed enough with the big public. What's the role of trials and how science moves forward? And the net result of this, we've seen it during the COVID pandemic, where a lot of people were actually blaming the medical community not to be fast enough, or if there were use of, let's say, vaccines, they were seen with a lot of reluctancy and a lot of concerns and a lot of issues that tapped into ethical aspects of doing research. So it is absolutely crucial that we explain how science moves forward. And science moves forward slowly, and has to, because some of these activities can be dangerous to patients' health. Clinical trials are basically the way at the moment the scientific method works to prove that something works and is safe, which is at the end of the day what we want. We can go into the details of how trials are designed, but in a nutshell, our goal is to prove that something is safe and effective. And we are trying to prove this in the most ethical way and the fastest possible way, even though, as I said, science takes its own time. And that's why I always tell my patients to be careful and skeptical when something is seen as too good, when it fixes everything and when it's brought to them absolutely without studies. Unfortunately, sometimes there are commercial interest and there are real scams, especially online. And that's the other reason people need to know how science moves forward so that they are not exposing themselves to risks.
Yeah, thanks for the big picture overview. And I think one of the things we want to do on this podcast episode, in this conversation, is talk about the background of clinical trials, but we also want to talk about how they actually run and the fact that there's a lot of people who are really passionately supporting this work and how that influences the Parkinson's community more generally. But right now, we're just going to stay focused for a couple more minutes on the sort of overview pieces, if you don't mind. Can you just say a little bit about what types of trials there are and what about phases of trial? What should people know about types of trial and phase of trial?
Absolutely. I'll give you an overview. Try not to talk too much because, as the listeners will understand soon, clinical trials are not possible without a big team of people. And actually, my job is quite limited. I do very little. And yes, as a PI, I might take credit. In reality, the credit comes from the fact that I take also responsibility if something goes wrong. But absolutely, I'm not really running the trials myself. Without the team, the people that the listeners will listen from very soon, none of what I'm saying is possible. So I'll try to be short here. Back to your question, what type of clinical trials we have? So in a nutshell, we can divide these trials in two big categories. We can have observational studies where we simply follow, say, a disease or a particular phenomenon within a disease over time. And some of these are, when we follow them over time, they're called longitudinal. Sometimes it's just a snapshot, and this is what we call it. We call this studies cross-sectional. Sometimes, and these are the easiest to do, we look back at what's happened, what's been done, and we call this retrospective studies. Obviously, the best studies in this context, the observational ones, are the longitudinal ones, because we say, okay, from now on, we follow all people suffering from Parkinson's disease because we want to see when they develop dyskinesias, just to mention a problem that Parkinson's can cause. So because it's longitudinal, we are following these people closely and in a very thorough and standardized fashion. So these are the type of studies that give us more information. Typical studies like these are also studies that are looking at the incidence or a prevalence of a disease. So how common a certain problem is. In particular, for incidence, we want to know how many new cases per year of a particular problem we see. But I guess the biggest interest goes for another type of trials, which are the interventional ones. So I told you about the observational, but now we talk about the interventionals. And interventionals, as the name says, are testing an intervention. This can be a medication, it can be a lifestyle change, it can be a rehabilitation technique, it can be a surgical treatment. And so in these trials, which are typically, they need to be at least prospective, we do an intervention. So we assess the patient before the intervention, right after the intervention, and then over time, also to see for how long that particular intervention has an effect. And so these are the two big groups of trials. You also mentioned the topic of phases. This is more of a technical term, but people need to know about it. Typically, there are 4 phases of research. Phase 1, 2, and 3, and 4, obviously. Phase 1 is the very beginning of when a human body is exposed to, let's say, a medication. Typically, phase 1 are done on a very few subjects, often normal subjects or subjects without the disease, volunteering to receive the treatment. Phase 2 is when this particular intervention is now given to patients, a bigger group. Usually phase 2 trials have the goal of discussing and determining whether that particular intervention is safe enough to move to phase 3. And in phase 3, we have a bigger group. Usually these are multi-center studies where people at this point are entering what we call a randomized controlled trial. Randomized means that a group of people get the treatment, the other group doesn't, and we cannot decide who gets it and who doesn't. So we really randomly let usually a computer decide who is receiving the active treatment versus not. And when I say, so I explain why randomized. Controlled means that we have a group that is not getting it, but is getting a placebo or another intervention. This is what we mean when we say controlled. And then if successful, they enter phase 4, where the medication is usually given, or medication or something else is given to a larger group of people. It's not blinded anymore. It's really a larger cohort of people followed for longer, usually a year. And these are meant to really explore the efficacy, but also safety-wise to detect potential concerning problems that are not visible when you only select and enroll few patients, because some rare events, you don't see them until you start enrolling more and more people. And sometimes you don't see them even in phase 4. You need to wait until the medication is approved and commercialized when something else happened. For example, in Parkinson's, there was a great drug called tolcapone, very effective, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, all good. was commercialized, very effective for Parkinson's, but then a rare event happened and happened in a few patients, that is liver failure. And so this is when everything had to be changed. All the procedure related to the use of this medication had to change. So in a way, a medication is always in a trial phase, even when it's finally commercialized.
Just to round out this part of this conversation, I wonder if you can say, how have you seen trials change over the years, and what changes have been most positive in the way trials are run, and the approaches that are being taken to clinical trials in Parkinson's? What changes have been most beneficial?
Yeah, this is a great question. I want to mention two things. The first one is that we realized that what patients care is not if they can have less tremor necessarily or can move better their fingers once we do the UPDRS, which is the classic scales we use for Parkinson's. They want to have a better quality of life. So that's why there's been a shift in the primary endpoints in many trials, where the trial has focused on scales measuring functioning, disability, quality of life, rather than the actual motor problem that comes from the disease. That's been a big change that was largely driven by the studies in deep brain stimulation, where we knew that deep brain stimulation was very effective, and yet patients weren't happy. And this is why we realized that sometimes these interventions cause speech problems. They're more important than having less tremor, because communication is key to humans. And I can give you many more examples. The other thing that we changed over the years is recognizing that some interventions that look like they are disease modifying, they're actually helping because they have a symptomatic effect, meaning that we test a medication thinking that the medication makes the disease slow down, and we see that. We see that because that medication has a positive effect against the symptoms of Parkinson's. So we're just masking the progression.
It sounds like one of the ways to summarize that is, it sounds like maybe through the trial process, one of the things that's changed is people involved in the process have started to pay more attention to the actual experience of the people with Parkinson's that are participating in these trials, rather than just looking at the outcomes that were initially approached or designed for the trial or chosen for the trial.
Correct.
Okay, so maybe last question I'll ask you at this point. What red flags should people watch out for if they're considering a trial, and how should somebody evaluate if a trial is a good fit for them?
That's a very good question because it's very practical. So first things first, clinical trials are designed and they're approved by ethical review boards. And the goal of the ethical review board is to make sure that what's proposed is plausible, is safe enough, that if there are unknowns that are clearly described in lay language to patients in the protocol. But the starting point, just to give you an answer in a few words, is to read carefully the protocol, the informed consent, and have to ask. And the other important point is to ask questions if something is not clear.
Yeah, and I guess I would add one little note there, which is that asking questions doesn't have to be limited to the people involved in the trial. In fact, I'll say this, I happen to live with Parkinson's myself, and I participated in some research, and I always went to other people, to my primary care doctor even, not even to my own movement disorder specialist, and said, hey, does this sound right for me? And sometimes I got no, and I ended up participating in the trial anyway because I talked to other people, and but that was just, it was part of my process, and I think it was an important part of my process.
Yeah, it is a valid point, but also we need to acknowledge that sometimes, especially when it's new interventions, there's not much knowledge out there, and few things might sound strange, and to someone who is not in the field, it makes sense to ask opinion, but also that needs to be taken into account, that that's probably the reason why you eventually decide to be part of the trial anyways. There is another type of information that you can gather online, and online can be a trap. So there are very few websites where people need to go to. But if you have a good understanding of biology, or the person you're asking to has, they can go on clinicaltrial.gov, which is a website that collects all the clinical trials. So if you're asked to be in a clinical trials and you don't find your clinical trials on that portal where these trials are typically recorded, that's suspicious. There are other databases. ClinicalTrials.gov is the most used one because it's the American one. But this is to say that there are also independent way to validate what you're told if you go online. Another great source of information is PubMed, which is what I call the Google for doctors. Where you can type a molecule or intervention, a disease, and you can see what's been done. Sometimes patients come to me and say, I want to do this treatment, the most exotic things ever heard, very expensive. Yeah, and I'm being told it's experimental, and it sounds like it's cool when it's experimental. But in reality, all that these people are receiving is a scam, is they're getting asked for money to be receiving these things. And sometimes in front of them, because I don't know all the trials, I go online and I show them what I will do if I were them. So I teach them what resources to use. And it happens that I type that intervention on PubMed, and there's not even a single paper on that. And so that gives me the confidence to say, stay away from these people. They're just scamming you. The other important thing is that people are not supposed to pay to be in clinical trials or in receiving experimental treatments. So if someone asks for money, that's a super red flag.
Arturo, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. And I'm just wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit about your background in Parkinson's and Parkinson's research.
Of course. Thank you so much for the invitation to this series. I think it's quite important to have these conversations with not only doctors, but also the whole team here. So my background is that I trained as a neurologist in my home country in Mexico, where I developed a real passion for movement disorders and neurodegenerative conditions, because it was, in my eyes, the most interesting in terms of physical examination and also quite challenging. But early on, I actually realized two things. First, that we were quite far away from really solving these issues and really treating people effectively in many of these cases. But at the same time, I also realized that we could have a very positive impact if we advocated for particular clinical needs and we really heard our patients. So that made me really get a very important interest into Parkinson's and other movement disorders. And over the years, since I've done research on several subtopics, let's call them, for example, social health determinants in Parkinson's disease, which I found quite interesting, particularly in Latin America, where we have a lot of divide in terms of how people live and how people interact with their own diseases.
Thanks for the background. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk with all of the team at Toronto, all of your team, is that when I participated in the first two trials I participated in, one was observational and one was testing a possibly neuroprotective new treatment, I was so surprised and impressed by the fact that there were so many knowledgeable people in the clinic. And in fact, at one point I went in and the person I had been seeing, the physician that had been there every other time, wasn't there, and there was a different physician. And I was like, oh, well, that was a surprise. But it turned out that was great for me because I got more time to talk to somebody else and hear their perspective. So I think, I guess I wanted to ask you if you could describe what it takes to run a trial, the different roles that are involved, and what value that brings to the experience for people with Parkinson's.
Of course. No, I think this is a fundamental question, because sometimes the general idea is that there's this entity that creates research and that's all, but really it's certainly a team effort, and running a clinical trial is the biggest example of this. So it takes knowledgeable, passionate people who ask the right questions, who test the correct hypothesis or meaningful hypothesis, but most importantly, who make sure also that the participants are safe and well cared for, and that the objectives of the research or the science that is being tested is with the intention of really helping a population. So in the end, the ultimate goal is to advance science and improve quality of life for people living with Parkinson's disease. And this does take more than just a doctor. It does take scientists, but also other people who may interact with people living with Parkinson's in different ways. This includes research coordinators, nurses, etc. And because trials involve human beings, this intrinsically has several ethical considerations. So that diversity in the team also is quite important, because that helps to dissipate these ethical issues or challenges that may come, because everyone has a different perspective on this issue. And that's I think the reason why the team should be so diverse and specialized at the same time. And I can talk about the different participants in this whole team, of course.
Yeah, if you don't mind, can you just run down a couple of the different roles? And I know that we'll speak about these again as the podcast progresses, but maybe you can just give a quick overview of what the different seats are, so to speak.
Yes, of course. So there are several levels of this. So, for example, we have the sponsors who usually provide funding that makes the study possible. We have a principal investigator and other sub-investigators that basically drive the study forward and maybe answer the big scientific questions in candor or try to prepare protocols that really will address this in a scientific, a very sound manner. We also have nurses. We have Yu-Yan here, for example, who is an excellent example on this. But this part of the team is incredibly versatile. So they can act as investigators, they can act as raters, as caregivers, and basically they are kind of the glue that holds everything together. They also handle follow-ups and make sure participants have overall a positive experience. And they can also be these conduits between participants and the clinical team and also the coordinators as well. So quite a versatile position. Then we also have the team coordinator, the research coordinators per se, who in my opinion is one of the toughest roles, because this involves not only knowing the science behind the things, but also basically they keep the project moving on. So they handle a series of things, for example, recruitment of patients, which intrinsically it's quite challenging always. They also handle ethics committee reviews, amendments to the protocols that must be done to ensure that the protocol, answers the correct questions. And of course, patient care and logistics as well. So it's a mixture between a scientist, somewhat a clinician, but also kind of a social work situation there. So it's quite an interesting position to be in. And then we have the IRB, which stands for Institutional Review Boards. We can talk about this more in depth, but this is fundamental. There is no research if there is no IRB approvals, basically. And this is because, as I told you before, the intrinsic ethical considerations that have to be done when we test drugs or interventions in people. So this committee basically ensures that everything meets the highest ethical standards and protects participants from harm or from maybe practices that are not correct. And finally, I also need to mention that maybe outside of the research team, we also have the participants' own care team. And this may include family, friends, the primary physician that takes care of this patient usually. And this is important to also kind of include in this list because that is a support that is essential for success. It can give reassurance. It can give also an objective measurement of outcomes or of, for example, adverse events. So it's very important to involve a network of support, particular to the patient.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about safety in a second, and I'll share an experience that I had that relates to why my care team was important, why a care team is important, and it'll be an example of my care team being important. But I had an adverse event occur in one of the studies I participated in. It was relatively minor, but the brakes were immediately thrown on my participation in the trial because they wanted to make sure that I was safe. And I was like, okay, well, that's really great. I appreciate that. On the other hand, they also didn't want to be the only people evaluating and I didn't want them to be the only people evaluating my experience of this adverse event. So my primary care doctor ended up being a source of reference for me. And they encouraged that too, so that I went back to my primary care doctor and he was involved in evaluating the test results that determined the nature of the adverse event. But tell me more about safety in clinical trials. So how can a person evaluate their risk tolerance and the safety profile of a trial and make sure they're in alignment?
Of course. I think this is also a very, very important question. So first of all, we need to make sure that the patient's or the participant's needs is addressed by the research question. So it makes no sense to, for example, enroll in a project that is studying dyskinesias if you maybe don't have that issue. And that's first. So you need to really be the good fit. And because of this, we have criteria that make people be included in a research protocol, but also exclusion criteria. So there are several visits that can be done before the actual research starts, but we can more or less screen for either inclusion criteria that might, propel a patient's participation, or exclusion criteria that may actually say, you know what, you might not be the best fit for this study in particular. And again, going back to the IRB, this is very important. And I think the IRB might be the most important, let's say, actor in the safety part of the research. The IRB has several roles into this that guarantee that this alignment is in place. They review the research protocols very, very minusculely, like with a magnifying glass, I would say. And basically, this is to assess potential risks, benefits, and to ensure that the research is adhering to the most important or highest standards of ethics. They also do a risk-benefit assessment analysis, so that because even if we know that the treatment might be safe, as your experience with the side effect that you have or adverse event, everyone can have an adverse event, but it has to be acceptable. It cannot be a risk that overcomes the benefits of this potential participation. That wouldn't be ethical at all. So there has to be a limit where we can say, okay, there might be some adverse events, but it cannot go for something that really endangers the participant. They also do that risk analysis. And more importantly, they also perform ongoing monitoring. So in different stages of the research, they might ask for preliminary information. They might have meetings with the several members of the research team, and therefore we can address these things. All of this is to very clearly adhere to very precise standards of ethics and conduct.
Sara, thank you for being here. And can you tell me about your background and the role of a coordinator in research trials, how you came to find yourself in this work?
Thank you very much for having me. I work as a research coordinator, clinical research coordinator at the Move and Sortis Clinic at UHN with Dr. Fasano and our clinical research team. I've been in this role for the past almost 4 years. And just to explain a little bit about my role, the role of clinical research coordinator, it generally sits in the middle of everything between patients, physicians, nurses, research staff. I'm there. I'm right in the middle of all of them. And I am basically from someone's very first contact with a study to their final follow-up. I help them navigate the procedures. This includes going over the consent form, answering their questions, explaining all of the procedures, scheduling visits, sending them reminders, making sure they feel not confused and supported along the way, which I think the last part is the most important part. So that's basically my role.
So in my experience of participating in research, I found the coordinator was kind of like the linchpin for everything I did. And everything I was doing was pivoting around this person. I felt so welcomed by them. And in fact, there were multiple people that I've worked with in that role over the years. And it's always the same story. They're the welcoming face that gets me to where I need to go next, and scheduling and all the procedures and all the things I need to do. Is there anything else somebody should know about the role of a coordinator in research for Parkinson's?
Yeah, so as you very beautifully mentioned, the research coordinator, when you participate in a trial, the research coordinator becomes your main point of contact, and most importantly, your advocate. So if something doesn't feel right, you reach out to us. If something feels off, you don't feel well, you definitely reach out to us. If life gets complicated, let's say you don't have time, you reach out to us. So but rely on your research coordinator. And again, they're your advocate when it comes to participating in clinical trials.
Thanks for that. And yeah, I would agree. That was my experience. That I did rely on them, and it was always to my advantage, and I think to the trial's advantage too, in terms of the outcomes were met, because people can stay when they have a supportive presence for them. And that's what I found in the coordinators I've worked with. So one thing about that means that you're touching base with people all the time when they're participating in research. Because you see so many people, I think you have an insight or access to an answer to the question, what attitudes and mindsets have you seen from participants that have contributed to the best experience? Who's happiest in a clinical trial? What approaches are common for those folks who have positive experiences? And then the flip side is, what approaches to clinical trials maybe lead to not so good experiences?
So I think the participants who seem to have the best experience in clinical trials, usually they come in open-minded and curious. They understand that clinical trials are not treatments, are not guaranteed treatments, and they approach it very realistically. And I think a very common mindset that they have They see themselves not as subjects or research subjects. They see themselves as partners in research, as participants, which I think it's a very beautiful and very important mindset to have. And I feel like those people usually feel less overwhelmed and less confused when participating in research and clinical trials. On the flip side, I think one of the hardest situations is when somebody joins a trial and they expect certainty from something that in nature is uncertain. When the hope is, this is going to fix me for sure, the emotional impact can be very heavy when the outcome is not what they expected originally. So I think that the mindset, as you also mentioned, is the most important thing when participating in clinical trials.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's tricky when you're living with a condition like Parkinson's for many people when you don't have a good option and you think you hear about a trial and you're like, well, maybe that would help this problem I have. And there's no treatment that's really helping you. So it just can be so complicated. And I appreciate you acknowledging that can present, if you enter a trial with the attitude that this is going to help me, well, you could get a placebo and potentially depending on the trial. So people need to know that. I agree. It's important. What other advice do you have for somebody if they're thinking about participating in research? How can somebody, for example, give themselves the best chance of being happy in a trial besides their approach? Is there anything else you have to say about that?
I think Dr. Fasano also mentioned that as well, but ask a lot of questions, as many as you want, as many as you can. Read the consent form very, very carefully. If you are able to, if you would like to bring somebody with yourself to read the consent form with you, and again, ask questions. And just always keep in mind that you have the right to take your time, to change your mind, to say no. And even if you sign the consent form, let's say, it's important to know that informed consent is not just a form that you sign one and done. I always make sure to tell this to my patients, that informed consent is an ongoing conversation. So participants always have the right to ask questions, to pause, to stop, to step back, and the research coordinators help protect that right.
Yu-Yan, thank you for talking with me today. And I wonder, can you just share a little bit about your background in generally, and then also in relation to Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's research?
Thank you for having me, Chris. So I have been a nurse in the movement disorder clinic for a little over 20 years. Before that, I was a nurse working at the intensive care unit. So how I came about to become involved in Parkinson's disease research is at that time, the deep brain stimulation clinical trial, I'm dating myself now, was coming to an end. It was many, many years ago. And that because of the complexity nature of this group of patients who have been struggling with Parkinson's for a long time, they require a lot of resources. So when I was first hired as just a clinic nurse is to help those group of patients who is finishing the clinical trial and help them manage their disease and also how to live their life productively in the community. So that was how I was hired, helping finishing the deep brain stimulation clinical trial as a clinic nurse. But as we go on, the need of the clinic, obviously the need of the patient also changes over time. And there are more and more new clinical trial. And as a nurse, we have the knowledge about the clinical trial. We try to communicate with the patient and the family in layman terms, and we try to spend more time with the patient and put it in their perspective on how a clinical trial may benefit them or may not benefit them. So with our clinical knowledge and our skills as clinician, we are usually able to assess the patient. And also when there is something unpredictable happens, we would like that the patient can reach out to us so we can have a quick conversation when the physician are sometimes very heavily engaged in other research activities. So we can triage the phone call. And if there's any question, we can spend more time with the patient. I would also like to think that we as nurses and coordinator, we are less intimidating sometimes compared to the physician. So they're more open to help to discuss with what are the pros and cons and how can we help them to participate in a clinical trial that can fit their lifestyles.
Yeah, I think in my experience, the nurses in every trial I've participated in were absolutely essential. And in fact, I think you alluded to this. I think nurses can be a kind of translator between the participant, and they were for me for sure, and the sort of science behind the interventions being investigated. Does that sound right to you?
Exactly. We try to put it in layman term and realistic. I like to use lots of analogy when I'm doing the clinical trial to help people understand what is required and what is the science behind the clinical trial.
Great. So I'd like to ask you the same questions I asked Sara, if I can, and just about the mindsets that lead to the best outcomes and the approaches that lead to the best outcomes, and your experience of what leads to maybe people having a less good experience.
Yeah, of course. So same as I would like to echo what Sara has to say is the mindset of going into clinical trial. Every patient participant is important. And we really appreciate every single participant who offer their time to help us advance in science. Our goal is to help advance science so we can provide better care. No clinical trial effort is too little. We do a whole range of clinical trials. Sometimes it's just one questionnaire. Sometimes as a clinical trial is a little bit more involved. So anybody who are interested in clinical trial or being approached for doing any clinical trial need to have an open mind. We collect the information. We do our best to move science forward, and we learn a lot. And I want to know, to let everybody know, even if the clinical trial outcome is not what we hope for, we take every single clinical trial as a learning experience to help us move along in science in advancing our care. And I think the public should understand that our intention is to make things better. I spend lots of time in education. Obviously, there's lots of explanation in terms of symptoms. There's a lot of terminology that is being used during a clinic visit. And very frequently, the physician comes in and say, you have this, and that. And there's so many different options in all the different care. So we usually come in, talk about their medication, and we do a lot to explain to them the side effect of every single medication. They take multiple medications. So as the role of nurses, we explain the medication, what are the side effects. We have a knowledge of the interaction of the medication. We help them manage their schedule, their life, and make sure that they can achieve what they want to achieve despite the complex medication schedule or the need or the demand of the disease. And we also do a lot of education over the phone with long-term care facility as well and any other community partner to promote wellness in Parkinson's disease.
What I would like to add to what you just said is that what I take away from it is whether you're participating in research or you're participating in a visit with your main neurologist, your movement disorder specialist, if you have a question and the doctor is not available to be in that part of the visit is over, see if you can talk to a nurse, because they are going to have an ability to help you if they can come into the room and spend some time with you. So I would encourage people to try for that if it's possible. It may not be possible, but if it can help, it can help you a lot if it is available to you.
Exactly. We try to do our best to address any question and even phone calls. If you have any questions, and we are more than happy to speak with you over the phone as well.
Yeah. So I guess in closing out this main part of our conversation, I guess I want to just say you might have an easier time getting a hold of somebody that's not the physician if you have a question about your research or your clinical care, regardless if you're participating in a trial. As we close out this conversation, I'd like to ask you all to answer two final questions, if you don't mind. What could change to make the clinical trial process better, more efficient, or smoother? In other words, what would you like to see change in the clinical trial process?
So the question is how clinical trials can be improved and where we're going moving forward. Clearly, there is room for improvement. I think in general, we need to be better at explaining what being in a clinical trial means, because I don't want people to think that clinical trials means being a guinea pig, because it's absolutely not what this is intended for. It goes back to educating the big public to how science works, and science is not perfect. But in terms of trial per se, we are now witnessing a revolution in the type of trials. We're doing, for example, what's being called basket trials, where different arms, different groups of people in large cohorts are enrolled. One group will function as a control, so receiving the placebo, and another group will receive intervention A, another group will receive intervention B, another group A followed by B, another one A and B together. And so see, what happens here is that you can test multiple interventions in different combination. So we're seeing more and more of this combined way because it's cheaper, it's more ethical, and it's faster because, and it's more importantly, it's leading towards the future, because one of the fundamental problems with trials is that we always test one thing at a time. And maybe the solution is to test two things together. Another thing that I can envision moving forward is that the clinical trials outcome measure will be different. And one thing that I think we have overlooked over the years is the concept of happiness. Because yes, quality of life, function, all this, but deep down, what we want is to see smiling, happy patients. And the thing is that happiness is difficult to be measured. But we're moving away from the dry approach to the disease, which I think is key in establishing also a better relationship with the care team and the research team in this case. And I can go on and on, but the good thing is that all of these things that I'm saying are implemented based on the mistakes of the past, and they're implemented quite fast because industry is behind many of these interventions, and industry don't want to waste money. And so that's why they have the interest to invest and invest wisely, not just to throw money at projects that have no future. So altogether, I think we're going to have brighter days moving forward.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think you actually answered my second question, which was what excites you about the future of clinical trials. And it sounds like you're excited about this, the progression we're making towards a different approach to clinical trials in terms of combining multiple ideas we want to explore into and applying those multiple ideas to the same group of people, but in different subgroups, maybe. And is that accurate?
It is, and this also gives me the opportunity to clarify another important point that is crucial, which is realizing that Parkinson's is not a single disease. It's a syndrome. It's a combination of different conditions. And more we are targeting particular population. This is called precision medicine. So future trials won't be, we give compound A to all Parkinson's patients. We're going to say we give compound A only to Parkinson's patients with this genetic mutation or with this particular feature.
I think that one of the fundamental changes that needs to be implemented is involving more the participants in the process of improving the clinical trials. Oftentimes, a clinical trial finishes and there's no feedback with the participants. No one knows what the results were. We don't communicate what we found. And we don't really hear as investigators what was the experience really from the participants. And I think that's a big flaw. Right now, there are these new trends of changing this, as Dr. Fasano mentioned, and I think that's very, very important because in the end, it's not doing, research just to have a research score as a scientist. It's the objective is to really help people with these conditions. That's the idea behind science, and I think that just listening more active and being more proactive with the communication with participants is very important. Also listening to the feedback with an open mind and really trying to implement that to improve further clinical trials. Maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm in the area of neuromodulation, deep brain stimulation, and so forth. But I do think that we are certainly making big steps towards a better understanding of how the brain networks are affected in several diseases. And I think that we will see several clinical trials coming up in the near future regarding on how we can electrically change these faulty networks in movement disorders, for example, in Parkinson's disease. And hopefully we can implement this as well in the near future in our patients.
Great, thank you. Sara, Yu-Yan, any perspective on those last couple questions?
Really have a comment that is not related to the question when you're
Sure.
talking about red flag in clinical trials.
Yeah, please.
So there's lots of therapy out there that is claimed to do a lot of things. So for example, if you see a clinical trial that is supposed to help your headaches, supposed to help your Parkinson's disease, supposed to help you numbness in your legs, supposed to help you your digestive system, it's very unlikely, knowing the science behind different disease and different health condition, it's very unlikely that there is one therapy that is good for everything. So to me, if it says that it's good, it's usually too good to be true. When there's a therapy that is being offered, it's going to make so much difference in your entire body. With the science that we know is not possible, because Parkinson's disease all these different diseases have different etiology. So we just need to keep in mind that sometimes when it's curing so many conditions, usually it's a little too good to be true.
Yeah, I think it's probably also true to be cautious about that if it's even just tackling a massive amount of Parkinson's specific symptoms. But frankly, if somebody said to me, this is going to cure Parkinson's, at this point, I would think, well, I'm not so sure. You're going to have to convince me that this one thing you're doing is going to solve that problem. And maybe that's an important thing to add there at the end of your comment. Do you think so?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how about the future of making the trial process better? Any insights from your role?
It's just like Dr. Fasano said earlier, education. We would like to bring awareness into the public. Any effort is helpful in terms of clinical trial. And we want to reduce the stigma of being an experiment or being subject when we do clinical trial is not just an experiment. There is a lot of paperwork involved, a lot of regulations that we have to follow. And Sara had put in a lot of effort working with all these different agencies to make a clinical trial happen. Ranges from just filling out a questionnaire to an interventional trial. So there is many, many layers of work, making sure that the research that we do is a sound research. We would like to move away from the stigma of being a guinea pig or being a experimental subject.
So, Sara, it looks like you're going to get the last word, which in my perspective is exactly appropriate, because the clinical coordinators for research, the clinical research coordinators are, as I said before, the linchpin from my experience. So what do you think? What's exciting to you about the future of the trial world for Parkinson's, and what could make it more efficient in the future?
I think one exciting thing that Dr. Fasano actually has been working a lot on it is, I think I'm actually echoing Dr. Abundes as well, when I say we have been trying to make clinical trials more patient-centered. Dr. Fasano has been collaborating a lot with the Patient Advisory Board of Toronto Western Hospital. We ask for their feedback anytime that we can when it comes to designing our studies, designing our protocols, and it's been extremely rewarding and very helpful to have their comments and their feedback part of our studies, which contributes to, again, making patients feel more like partners and participants rather than just subjects.
And it sounds like maybe if somebody wanted to know more about that, they could talk with the clinical research coordinator or any member of the clinical trial team while they're participating, just to see, is there anything going on that I could participate in on that front? Because I think you're right. A lot of people and a lot of different organizations are starting to have those advisory boards. And I think it's great to be a part of those if you can. Well, thank you, Team Toronto. I really appreciate you all taking the time to talk about the clinical trial process with me. And thank you for the work you do to support the Parkinson's community. It means a lot to the community. It means a lot to the Davis Phinney Foundation. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's Podcast. For more information about the Davis Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people affected by Parkinson's, please visit davisphinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org. This content includes information, insights, and opinions from our Parkinson's community. The views expressed are those of individual participants and do not constitute medical advice. This content is not intended to substitute for the guidance, advice, or recommendations of your personal healthcare providers.